On today's Exploring History podcast, I want to take you down memory lane to a time and place in history that is almost forgotten, a time that is different from today in many ways. I want to take you back to the time of my growing up in a small town in the 1950s and 1960s.
Welcome to Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History.
Sometimes the younger generation doesn't understand what life was like for their parents and grandparents when they were growing up. Recently, our son, who is in his mid-40s, was with his sons at the reproduction of a large stone fort that French settlers built in southern Illinois in the 18th century. One of his sons asked him, "Was this the kind of house you had when you were growing up?" The 19th century British historian Thomas Carlyle said, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." With all due respect to Mr. Carlyle, I disagree. Great men and women surely have a huge impact on history, but I believe history is also the story of millions of everyday people who live and work and pray, who love their families and keep alive the great truths of God, who do good and not evil, and who live as best they can in their corner of the world. I know that my life is no more valuable or noteworthy, and no less valuable or noteworthy, than the millions of lives of those who have lived the same span of time as I have on this planet. The historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said that history, by putting crisis in perspective, supplies an antidote to every generation's illusion that its own problems are uniquely oppressive. In something of the same way, I think it's easy for today's young people to think that things have always been the way they are now, that we have always had cell phones, home computers, 300 channels on television, that today's heroes are the only heroes that are worth admiring, and that in the past people wandered around in ignorance and confusion until the current generation came on the scene to make things right. One job of today's parents and grandparents is to tell them that this is not the case, that life was both harder and easier in times gone by, that yes, we had patterns and habits that we should have realized were wrong because we weren't ready to see it, but that we also had firmer answers for life because we hadn't rejected those answers. And we had heroes that would put some so-called heroes of today in the shade. In this podcast, I want to share some memories of what it was like for me growing up in a small town in Tennessee in the 1950s and 1960s. There are many similarities to today, of course, but I want to emphasize how things were different then from the way they are today, so that you can appreciate what you have, how some things have changed for the better, and so that you might consider what we have lost and how we might get some of the worthwhile things back. These memories took place at different times in my life, but I've tried to organize them into topics that seem to define America as I knew it then, as opposed to a chronological account. I was born in the extremely hot summer of 1952, during the last few months of Harry Truman's presidency, and a few months before Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. The house I came home to was a frame house without air conditioning, in a neighborhood that was developed during the period before and just after World War II, just outside of downtown Columbia. My father was a typesetter for the local newspaper and a veteran of World War II, as were many men in our town. My mother was a homemaker who had been born in England. I have one brother 5 years older than I. With two boys, our family was much like the families of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson and Ward and June Cleaver that we would soon watch on television. That brings me to my first theme, which is television. Our lives in great measure revolved around television. In 1957, shortly before I turned 5, we moved to a new subdivision on the edge of town into a 2-bedroom, 1-bath brick house with a den and a living room and an eat-in kitchen that was maybe 1,000 square feet with one window unit air conditioner and an attached garage. The house sat on a 100-foot by 100-foot bare lot. My dad sowed grass and planted trees, shrubs, and a hedge. My parents paid $13,000 for it. The fence at the back of our backyard was literally the city limits. Beyond it was a horse pasture. Ours was one of the first houses built in the subdivision, which would eventually come to have about 90 houses total along 3 streets. At the back of the house, Dad mounted a television antenna, a long pole stuck in the ground next to the house and attached to the house, extending about as high as the roof. The pole had a complex set of wires sticking out at odd angles from the center shaft near the top. It was the same antenna that just about every other house we knew had sticking up behind it as well. Somehow, magically, that weird-looking antenna captured the signals from the television stations broadcasting from Nashville, about 45 miles away. The flat coaxial cable fed from the antenna through a hole in the cement block foundation and up through another hole in the floor of our tiny den and connected to our maybe 15 or 18-inch black and white television set in the corner. We could receive 3 channels or stations, which were the Nashville affiliates of the 3 national networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Public television came along much later, though I never watched much public television, and later still came cable reception. Satellite dishes were far in the future. Through that miracle box, we saw the world. In the mornings, we turned on local talk and music shows. In the summer, I watched Captain Kangaroo. Later in the morning, Mother and I watched game shows like Concentration, The Price is Right, Video Village, and others while she did her housework. At noon, we watched a Nashville talk and entertainment show appropriately titled Noon. I give Mother credit that she did not watch the soap operas in the afternoon. In the later afternoons, we watched American Bandstand, old movies, another local music program — this was Nashville after all — and then came the news. Our choice was usually the Huntley-Brinkley Report on NBC, and then we watched the local news from Nashville. Then the evening primetime shows began. All 3 networks from 6:30 to 10, or, as we were often reminded, 7:30 to 11 Eastern Time, would offer a stream of situation comedies like Andy Griffith, Dobie Gillis, and Dick Van Dyke, westerns like Have Gun Will Travel, Rawhide, and Wagon Train, detective shows like Peter Gunn, and courtroom dramas such as Perry Mason, variety shows such as Ed Sullivan, Perry Como, Dean Martin, and many others, and game shows such as What's My Line?, I've Got a Secret, and To Tell the Truth. We always knew what was on TV because we always bought TV Guide magazine for 15 cents on our Thursday afternoon grocery shopping trips. More about that in a moment. For several years, I memorized the primetime lineup for all 3 networks for every night of the week. I had a lot of time on my hands. On Saturday mornings, I'd watch the cartoon shows. The one bit of culture I got on Saturdays was the half-hour program Exploring, hosted by Dr. Albert Hibbs, a scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. The content of the show would vary from week to week, sometimes science, sometimes history. I'd watch it faithfully. I can still hum the theme song. On some Saturdays, I'd go bowling for a while with friends. More commonly, in warmer weather, I'd go with friends to the local putt-putt miniature golf course, where I could play for several hours for a small fee. You have to realize that my brother, 5 years older than I, was a baseball and football star in our hometown, from Little League through high school. My parents were loyal fans, and we rarely missed a game. I, on the other hand, never got past neighborhood pickup games and church league softball. My brother did humble himself to play wiffle ball with me in our backyard, but as I remember it, he always won. I played a great deal by myself in our yard, throwing a tennis ball against the wall of the house to simulate baseball, shooting baskets at the goal by our driveway, playing golf with a putter and a plastic golf ball, aiming for a can I put in the ground, and always, for any sport, speaking the play-by-play out loud as I did so. On Saturday afternoons in the spring and summer, I'd watch Major League Baseball, and in the fall, college football, because that was the only time they were on, just like I watched pro football on Sunday afternoons because that was the only time it was on. Saturday evenings we had the Lawrence Welk Music Extravaganza, the Gunsmoke Western, and other offerings. I remember well the first live television broadcast across the Atlantic from England to the U.S. in 1962 via the Telstar satellite. There weren't multiple broadcast and telephone satellites covering the globe. In 1962, there was one. The 1960s were the time of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. I remember the launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik in 1957 and going outside at night and watching it cross the heavens. All three networks covered live every American manned spaceflight from well before launch in the early morning until splashdown a few hours later. Eventually, the space flights lengthened into several days, but coverage was still extensive even then. And of course, there were the unforgettable television commercials. Some of the phrases and jingles became part of American life. A commercial would often have a pitchman or woman telling the great benefits of the product they were selling, whether it was floor wax or an automobile or a pain reliever. Or maybe an off-camera announcer would tell how the product would make your life easier or make you more attractive. One huge presence were the cigarette commercials. Everybody in the commercials gave you the idea that smoking cigarettes made your life better, with no warning about the ill effects. This continued until an act of Congress banned cigarette advertising from television as of 1971. For whatever reason, my family didn't go on annual vacations. My dad got 1 week of vacation per year, and he used that time to work on the house, such as painting a room or two. Dad worked 6 days a week, but on Sunday afternoons, he frequently took my brother and me on hikes through the fields behind our house. I know he would probably rather have taken it easy on his only day off, but maybe the hikes were for his exercise as well as time with us. That's a special memory I have of a special man. For some period of time, our weekly routine involved grocery shopping on Thursday afternoons after Dad got off work. We got our usual staple items, including a half-gallon of milk for 43 cents, a half-gallon of ice milk for 39 cents, ice cream was too expensive, canned vegetables for 10 or 15 cents per can, and a large box of powdered milk. When we got home, Mother would put away the groceries while Dad made milk. He would make a quart of powdered milk, add a quart of whole milk, and voila, he had stretched the milk to a cheaper form. It worked on cereal, at least. Meanwhile, Mother would warm up supper. When it was ready, we would sit in the den in front of the television, eating our pot pies from TV trays, and watch Gilligan's Island. It was a ritual. We ate well, but it was nothing spectacular. Wheaties, Cheerios, and Chex cereals, Spam, Vienna sausage, bologna, and hot dogs. Potato chips and Fritos were about our only choices of chips. My mother was a good cook. Roast beef and gravy was standard on Saturday nights. Hamburgers and French fries were standard both at home and when we ate out. We never had macaroni and cheese. That was not on Mother's radar. I didn't have pizza until I was in high school when an Eat-In Pizza Hut franchise came to town. Dad had a few specialties that he prepared, rich chocolate fudge, pancakes, and on those occasions when he would grill out, hamburgers and sirloin steaks. My dad's parents lived in Columbia, and we were close to them. When my parents needed to leave me with them for an evening, my grandmother would often play the card game canasta with me. My grandmother died when I was 12. My grandparents never owned a television. But when my grandparents came to our house on holidays, my grandfather was glued to our television set, watching the images on it. He didn't believe that space travel was real. He thought the moon landings were staged in the desert Southwest or somewhere like that. The big family event every year was our Mother's Day picnic. After church on Mother's Day Sunday, we would pick up my grandparents and head to a church building in the country that was the place of worship for several of our ancestors. My grandfather's brother and his family drove down from Nashville to join us. The men would pull some shutters from the church windows and lay them between the hoods of the cars, where the women would put the abundance of food that they had prepared. We would enjoy a leisurely meal in the beautiful Tennessee springtime weather. Then after lunch, the men would replace the shutters, and we would visit family cemeteries nearby, where the older members of our family would put flowers on the graves of some of our ancestors. The day helped us stay connected to our roots. In 1974, I took Charlene to that same church building, got down on one knee, and asked her to marry me. I have mentioned before that my mother was from England and that she met and married my dad during World War II. There were several other women in Columbia who had married servicemen during the war. These women formed the Allied Friendship Club. They met once a month or so for many years and developed close friendships. I remember especially a woman from Scotland and one from Sweden. I believe there was a woman from Germany in the club as well. Any enmity from the war was long since buried. Another big area of our lives were our automobiles. Our family owned a series of used cars from the same dealer in Columbia that my dad trusted. The first one I remember was a yellowish 1956 Plymouth, followed by a 1959 Chevrolet with huge tail fins, then a 63 Chevy. My first car was a 63 Volkswagen from the same dealer, which I bought about the time I learned to drive in 1968 for $600. This car was a dream come true, since I had been intrigued by the car for years. I especially enjoyed Volkswagen ads in magazines. My dad taught me to drive on that car, but the clutch and the stick shift in the floor were hard for me to grasp at first. Dad had some serious doubts that I'd be able to learn on it, but I eventually did. However, I took my driver's license test on the family car that had automatic transmission. And of course, in all of these cars, there were no seat belts, no car seats for children, no air conditioning, and only AM radio. In the early 1960s, gasoline cost about 23 cents per gallon, and an attendant pumped it for us. It was thought to be unsafe for regular people to pump their own gas, just like it was generally understood that regular customers couldn't check out their own groceries. The gas station attendant would often clean the windshield and check the oil and tires as well. And we bought gas at service stations. There weren't any convenience stores. When we took trips, we drove on highways because there weren't interstates where we lived. You might try driving on U.S. highways sometime. There's much less traffic. You get to see beautiful scenery, and you'll meet fewer big trucks along the way. Of course, a major emphasis for us was school, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., September through May. I started school in 1958 in the first grade. There was no public kindergarten at the time. I attended Riverside Elementary School, located, appropriately, beside the Duck River in my old neighborhood. I rode the bus to and from school every day. Riverside School was a New Deal WPA project that was built in the 1930s. The town's junior high consisted of 2 buildings, one relatively newer, as well as one that was the former high school that had been built in 1915, which my dad had attended. Our new high school was built on the far edge of town in the mid-'60s. In elementary school, we had 3 teachers for each grade. Each teacher taught every subject for her classroom. At Riverside, all the faculty were females, mostly older, except for one male 5th-grade teacher whom I had, as well as the male school principal. We had hot lunches in the school cafeteria for $1 per week, which we paid to the teacher on Monday morning in a weekly ritual. Most of the teachers in junior high were females also. I rode the bus to and from school until I was in high school and started driving to school. The bus I took to high school, until I started driving, came by our house at 6:55 a.m., since it had another route to run before the school day began. Then there was the music, and the music was rock and roll. We had 2 radio stations in Columbia, one that signed off at sunset and one that reduced power in the evening from its 1,000 watts daytime power to 250 watts at night. In other words, it broadcast maybe to the county line in the daytime and to the city limits at night. At night, however, thanks to the wonder of radio signals bouncing off the atmosphere, we could pick up 50,000-watt clear channel stations from far away. My favorite was WLS Music Radio from Chicago. There was rock and roll for years before the Beatles made a splash, and then it seemed as though a deluge of groups and solo singers washed over us. Just about everyone owned a small transistor radio, AM only. We also listened to music on the record player in our room, on vinyl 45s and albums, and on the AM radio in the car. Only occasionally we saw rock music on television. Many acts weren't considered acceptable to appear on family television. For instance, when Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, Sullivan insisted that the camera only show Elvis above the waist. I do think the music from the 60s and early 70s is still the best popular music, and that's why we still hear it in many restaurants and waiting rooms. I had my own brief career in radio. For a couple of years when I was in college, I was a part-time announcer, in other words, I was a DJ, for the 1,000-watt station on weekends and during the summer when the regular announcers took vacations. The station played easy listening during the daytime, so I seldom had a chance to play the music I really liked. But my job meant that for a time I was in the radio business, living the dream. The minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. I think I eventually moved up to $1.75 an hour. For 2 weeks in 1973, I was the nighttime DJ on WKRM. I borrowed the moniker of John Records Landecker on WLS and became Records Ray. Please don't hold it against me. I carried a newspaper route from the middle of the 8th grade through high school to about 80 subscribers in our subdivision. The Daily Herald was an afternoon paper, so either Mother picked me up from junior high or I rode the bus from high school into town and met Mother at a predetermined location, and she would take me to the Herald office. I would pick up my papers, count them to make sure I had the right number, and then she would take me to our subdivision. Over time, I either walked, rode a bike, or eventually drove the route in my VW. The Herald was published 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, so every day, hot or cold, rain or snow, I had to get to the Herald office and then get the papers delivered. I remember my first day I carried the route. We were out of school because of snow, but somehow Mother got me to the Herald office and got me home, and I walked the route, doubling back a few times to make sure I had actually delivered papers where I was supposed to. A subscription to the paper was 40 cents per week. I'd collect on Friday afternoons after delivering the papers and also make some calls on Saturday mornings. Then we'd go to the Herald circulation office for me to settle up. Of the 40 cents, my profit was 15 cents per week per subscriber. You can do the math. That doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't. But those profits enabled me to buy that first car and a small black and white television for my room, as well as providing me with spending money. The financial numbers were different in those days. Sure, the prices were lower than they are now, but so were the incomes. The change in prices is due to that terrible marvel called inflation. I have mentioned the $1.60 minimum wage, the grocery prices, and the $13,000 house my parents bought. My dad worked for over 50 years for the newspaper, counting the time when he carried a newspaper route starting when he was 13. If I remember correctly, the most he ever earned as a typesetter, even with all that experience, was about $18,000 a year. When he retired in 1981, besides his Social Security check, he received a pension from the Herald of $600 a month, and he lived quite comfortably. We didn't think much about the topic of communication, but we had important dynamics of it. We had one corded telephone that hung on the wall in the kitchen. At times, our parents also had an extension phone in their room, which was perhaps 50 feet away. When you picked up the receiver of the phone, you heard a dial tone, which meant that you could dial the number. Look for a picture of a phone dial from that period. We paid a monthly rental fee for the phone to the Bell system. We never owned it. Alexander Graham Bell came up with the rental agreement idea as telephones were just beginning to catch on, and the practice continued. We paid extra for every long-distance call, which we made by dialing O for operator and asking her to place the call. The Bell system came up with the advancement of area codes when I was in junior high. We could then dial our own long-distance numbers, but we still had to pay extra for doing so. Recently, I called a friend who lives in another state, and we talked on our cell phones for almost an hour and a half. The cost for that call on a landline when I was growing up would have been astronomical, so we rarely made long-distance calls. We had a couple of forms of communication in our family that I think were unusual. I would often go visit friends who lived in our subdivision in the afternoons. When it was time for supper, Dad would go onto our tiny front porch, put 2 fingers in his mouth, and whistle very sharply and very loudly. I could hear that whistle all over the subdivision. The whistle was my signal to come home for supper. Unusual communication, but it worked. We had one indoor movie theater in Columbia, and it had one screen. My parents would sometimes drop me off to see a movie with friends. Admission was less than $1. When the movie was over, I would go to the phone booth outside the theater, put in my dime, and call home. I would let it ring a couple of times and then hang up. That was the signal to my parents that I was ready to be picked up, and I got my dime back because my call was not answered. I guess we took advantage of the phone system to send a message without paying for it, but I don't think we put the Bell system in financial trouble by doing so. The church we attended was in our old Riverside neighborhood. My parents were charter members when the congregation began after World War II, and the neighborhood was building up. I also attended Sunday evening youth group there for many years. One minister who served there, who had been a Marine sergeant during the Korean War, made a special effort to encourage me, and I think he had a big influence on my life. It might sound as though I think my growing up years were idyllic times with no problems. They are a special time in my memory, but I know they weren't perfect. One major negative reality I look back on with great sadness was the strict segregation in place in those times. Our town was strictly segregated. Our neighborhoods were segregated. Our schools were segregated until I was in high school in the late 60s, when a federal judge ordered that we integrate to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling of 15 years earlier. The way the school system accomplished this was simply to close the schools for black children and send them all to the nicer, better equipped, formerly all-white schools. The movie theater was segregated. Black patrons sat in the balcony, as was the practice in many southern towns. We also had a drive-in theater in Columbia. You hung a speaker on your car window to listen to the movie while you watched the movie on a big screen in front of you. I assume the drive-in did not admit black people, but I don't know that for sure. There were 2 public swimming pools I went to in Columbia, and black people were not admitted to either of them. I remember a laundromat we passed when going into town, which had a separate entrance and separate facilities clearly marked for black persons. I remember the water fountain in the county courthouse marked for whites only. I remember when I was in the 6th grade, this would have been 1963 or 64, at the height of the civil rights movement, that my Sunday school teacher told us one day that if a black man came to our church, he would be asked to leave, that it just wasn't right for a black person to come to our church. That was a view that most white Columbians and many other white Americans accepted in our day. When integration began to happen in our town, it happened peacefully as far as I knew. In a broader sense, regarding life in the 50s and 60s, we didn't know what we didn't have. By that I mean we didn't miss having cell phones and computers on our desks with internet connections because we didn't know to miss them. As David McCullough said, we didn't live in the past. We lived in the present, our present, and we enjoyed what we had and enjoyed new things as they came along. We still had the same failings and sins we confront today, except we didn't talk about them in public or watch them discussed on television. I suppose we did have a simpler life in that we had fewer choices before us, but with the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the USA, war every few years in the Middle East, inflation as a constant companion, the Vietnam conflict, and as the 60s wore on, political assassinations and an unraveling of standards we had always accepted, it seemed complex enough to us at the time. I could go on for a long time about other aspects of my life growing up, but maybe this is enough for now. I encourage you to talk to your parents and grandparents about their experiences growing up. Some things you'll wish were still true, while with other things you'll be thankful you don't have to live through it. This has been fun for me. I hope it has been for you. I'm Ray Notgrass. Thank you for exploring my personal history with me today.
This has been Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, and please leave a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our episodes. If you want to learn about new homeschool resources and opportunities from Notgrass History, you can sign up for our email newsletter at exploringhistorypodcast.com. This program was produced by me, Titus Anderson. Thanks for listening.